For many years during their heydays, the big tobacco companies had no real need to delve into and confront science and scientific claims about the harms of smoking. Of course, their ads sometimes portrayed a smiling doctor with a cigarette. Still, they never had to really deal with the actual scientific scrutiny. That would eventually change. Let's discuss when 5 massive US tobacco companies got together to enter the science scene. Not to seek the truth, but to twist the scientific narrative and confuse the public. If we want to understand why public trust in science is eroding or has eroded, we need to look at one of the most influential tactics ever used to create doubt in science. So, forget social media, unfriendly countries, and anti-vaxxers for a moment, because if you ask me, the story we're about to discuss is one of the critical turning points in the downfall of public trust in science. This is the story of how the US tobacco industry realized its potential demise and, in response, hijacked and manipulated science to flip the script. The first steps towards the collapse of scientific trust. The tobacco industry in the US enjoyed a constant influx of profits, especially since it had an effective recruitment of enslaved Africans during the 17th century. This strategy of slave use allowed the industry to increase the yield while reducing the cost of production. And this turned out to be a game changer, especially as Europeans' demand for tobacco skyrocketed during the 18th century, further expanding the tobacco-derived profits. By the end of the 19th century, tobacco was one of the greatest sources of state revenues in the US, and a third of their federal revenues came from tobacco taxes. And I'm not suggesting that societies had been ignorant of the possible effects of smoking before this. In fact, in the early 17th century, King James VI argued that smoking was dangerous to lung health and the senses, which resulted in tariff on tobacco imports.
A custom loathsome to the eye, hateful to the nose, harmful to the brain, dangerous to the lungs. I am Scottish.
However, as we saw, tobacco was good for the economy, and the tariff was later removed to avoid more economic damage to the budding American colonies. So, as you can see, the tobacco industry enjoyed enormous budgets, which they then dedicated to advertising. They had the best artists and designers, poster boy politicians, actors, and athletes to promote their products. The tobacco companies also convinced repressed groups that their products represented freedom and independence, especially for women. Massive campaigns convinced women and society that smoking symbolized elegance, feminism, and independence rather than prostitution. Women could smoke their cigarettes with style and stick it to their husband or dad. At some point, the tobacco industry reached a new level when they realized they could use medical doctors in their advertising. Doctors were trusted and intelligent, and by showing them holding or talking about cigarettes in familiar or scientific context, they anchored cigarettes to trust. The fact that they could get away with it is quite amazing. I'm curious, what is the most outrageous tobacco promotion tactics that you've come across? Let us know in the comments below. But anyway, what the tobacco companies were doing is called social engineering, or social engineering of consent. Historian of medicine Alan Brandt, who wrote the book The Cigarette Century, nicely described the tobacco industry's tactics in a 2012 review.
The industry took a product that had existed at the cultural periphery and remade it into one of the most popular, successful, and widely used items of the early 20th century.
I've linked Brandt's review in the description below if you're interested. It's quite a nice read. As you can see, times were good for the tobacco industry, but something was about to change. Of course, this smooth next to obstacle-free success of our protagonist, the tobacco industry, had to slow down at some point, at least briefly. The public had become increasingly concerned about the health effects of smoking by the mid-1920s. Cases of lung cancer started spiking, and this spike correlated nicely with the increases in cigarette consumption. The relationship between smoking and cancer was becoming apparent, and studies were finding all kinds of toxins in cigarettes. And then to rub salt in the tobacco industry's wound, this man entered the stage. Meet British psychologist Richard Doll. Doll's research in the late 40s confirmed a causal relationship between smoking and lung cancer. Over the year, he would go on to publish several studies reinforcing this connection, including the landmark British doctors study in 1954 that followed about 40,000 doctors over 20 years. The tobacco industry was in a state of crisis. The trust the US tobacco industry had built for itself started collapsing. They could say goodbye to the momentum they gained from John Wayne, Ronald Reagan, Sinatra, Crosby, and that smiling doctor. But of course, our protagonist would not give up that easily. Tough time requires tough decisions, and the tobacco industry would show the world it meant business. Remember how the tobacco industry had perfected the engineering of public consent? Well, if PR could manipulate consumer consent, it sure as hell could manipulate its arch nemesis, the highly esteemed science.
If science had historically been dedicated to the making of new facts, the industry campaign now sought to develop specific strategies to unmake a scientific fact.
In December of 1953, the CEOs of the world's 5 most powerful tobacco companies met at Hotel Plaza in New York to plan and strategize the upcoming war on science. And what strength could they use to their advantage if not their true and tested PR and social engineering strategies? But in times of crisis and distrust, they needed a refined approach. Meet John W. Hill, then president of the leading PR firm Hill & Knowlton. Hill was known for successfully managing corporate crises, especially those involving complex public controversies. Now, he had become the mastermind behind the tobacco industry's strategy to regain public trust. For Hill, advertising alone was insufficient. It reeked of self-interest, so instead, he would engineer public consent and uncertainty behind the scenes. He would skillfully manage the media, but more on that later. Instead of rejecting the science outright, which would just radiate of self-interest, they would continuously call for more research. And as long as there was always more to investigate, the science would remain unsettled in the eyes of the public. So what better way to achieve this than by emphasizing on science's core principle, skepticism? In other words, Hill's strategy was to use skepticism to create doubt against science itself. And as a result, the tobacco industry dedicated massive campaign money to convince the public that the smoking cancer topic consisted of 2 sides of a controversial debate. If we today think of the tobacco industry's tactics as straightforward or obvious, it's because we now recognize these tactics all too well. But at the time of the Hotel Plaza meeting in December of 1953, many of these strategies were unheard of and groundbreaking. The tobacco industry, with the expertise of the PR firm Hill & Knowlton, would hire scientists. With a panel of so-called skeptical scientists, often smokers, Hill & Knowlton gathered statements critical of the causal relationship between smoking and cancer. These statements helped the PR firm to create a stable basis for the campaigns that were to come. Let me ask you this: how can a private company truly control the scientific narrative or the scientific knowledge? The answer might seem rather simple: by funding the research. Today, companies around the world, private companies, fund universities and researchers left and right without raising many eyebrows. But in the 1950s, such fundings were relatively uncommon and often met with skepticism. Still, just giving money to science, for example, through large controlling entities like the National Institute of Health would limit the industry's ability to shape public opinion. So instead, Hill proposed partnering up with university scientists. If the money went directly to the scientists, they'd create a bond. The secret was to push the tobacco industry's commitment to science and hide its self-interest.
This tactic offered several essential advantages. The call for new research implied that existing studies were inadequate or flawed. It made clear that there was more to know, and it made the industry seem a committed participant in the scientific enterprise rather than a self-interested critic.
With their participation in health research, the US tobacco companies were now on track to convince the public of their shared concern for public health. Now say hello to the Tobacco Industry Research Committee, TIRC. This seemingly independent research body was designed to create the illusion of unbiased scientific inquiry while orchestrating confusion.
The TIRC marks one of the most intensive efforts by an industry to derail independent science in modern history.
The introduction of the TIRC resulted in the now infamous advertisement, a frank statement to cigarette smokers, which they published in over 400 newspapers. The so-called frank statement portrayed the tobacco companies as concerned corporate citizens, pledging to investigate the health risk of smoking for the sake of public safety.
We accept an interest in people's health as a basic responsibility, paramount to every other consideration in our business. We believe the products we make are not injurious to health. We always have and always will cooperate closely with those whose task it is to safeguard the public health.
Under Hill's guidance, behind the scenes, the TIRC would produce a constant stream of research. Their goal wasn't to answer critical scientific questions about cigarettes' links to diseases or cancer, but to delay the public's understanding of health risk associated with smoking. So they did this by conducting broad research rather than answering specific questions that risked exposing the harms of tobacco or smoking. Now, if you've ever worked at a biotech or pharmaceutical company, you're familiar with the so-called Scientific Advisory Board. If you're unfamiliar with the concept, a Scientific Advisory Board contains a panel of experts who guide scientific research, policies, or technical matters to an organization or company. Now, we can thank Hill and Knowlton for the emergence of this type of node connecting industry and academic researchers. The TIRC's Scientific Advisory Board included carefully handpicked scientists who would never directly investigate or propose research into the smoking cancer links. Again, the TIRC programs disguise their true aims behind their official interest in fundamental research, including genetics, immunology, and pharmacology. And this worked because they could convince the involved researchers that they were merely independent researchers in groundbreaking science. We don't think about it today, but these projects create a tight bond between private, profit-driven companies and supposedly neutral and independent research. This connection between private and academia doesn't need to necessarily be nefarious or malignant. Still, in this case, the tobacco companies manipulated the Scientific Advisory Board to redirect funds from research on the effects of tobacco to that of more general questions. Let's remember and emphasize that the scientific consensus by the 50s and 60s already agreed that smoking caused several diseases and posed a risk to individuals and public health. Still, despite all of this, the tobacco industry could convince the public that the issue was an active and highly contested scientific controversy. But how could the tobacco industry and its scientific arms convince the public about all this? Shouldn't the scientific consensus be a strong enough argument? Well, it should, but it's not. A crucial part of this campaign involved convincing the media of this so-called controversial topic. As a result, Hill committed much of his PR strategy to meet with representatives of media outlets. Whenever the TRC published a press release, the PR companies would personally contact media outlets and request them to balance their reported views. Of course, that meant treating press releases similarly to the evidence-supported research. In other words, Hill and Knowlton required their small group of skeptics to receive the same importance or attention as the scientific consensus. Brandt explains this best.
In this sense, the public relations campaign advantaged critical aspects of mid-century media practice. First, journalists favored reporting on controversy. Second, by providing opposing positions as if they were equal, they affirmed their commitment to balance.
This strategy worked because few journalists had scientific training or education. I'm curious, what do you think? Could the same tactics work today? Let us know what you think in the comments below. The tobacco company and its TIRC, or the scientific arm, also had a gigantic accessibility to scientific informants. Whispering birds. These whispering birds would inform the TIRC whenever new evidence against the tobacco appeared. And sometimes, because of this, the TIRC would have rebuttals ready even before the scientific reports were published. Now, how about this famous, or better yet, infamous tobacco lobby everybody knows about? Is that related to the TIRC or the Scientific Advisory Board? Well, kind of. In 1958, the tobacco industry created the Tobacco Institute, which was a powerful lobbying organization which they had designed to influence political and regulatory landscapes. By the 1960s, scientists from the Scientific Advisory Board started becoming a bit concerned about their independence and reputation, and it realized that it needed to further decouple the company's financial interests and its scientific arms, the TIRC and the Scientific Advisory Board. And by separating these two, it could maintain the scientists' supposed objectivity, or at least the impression of it, while the industry could continue to push their harmful products and confuse the public about the health risks of smoking. So there you have it. This is how a joint effort between the biggest US-based tobacco companies and a committed PR firm managed to flip the table during one of the industry's most challenging times. Once the scientific community and the public concerns about the harmful effects of smoking intensified, they created an Aikido-like strategy. If you're unfamiliar with Aikido, its basic principle is to take advantage of the opponent's force. By leaning into the curious, truth-seeking uncertainty ingrained in science, and by investing massive money in the process, they could hijack the scientific discourse and create doubt about their harmful products. During this successful process, the private sector in different fields learned to take advantage of the scientific discourse and dupe the public or delay any decisions that could hurt profit. This event has guided several large businesses to regain any threatened reputation or convince us about the good deeds that they do. It taught Big Pharma, Big Agriculture, and other influential voices associated with science how to influence and tighten the relationship with other businesses, universities, decision makers, and media outlets. And although we see that the tobacco industry's original tactics may have shifted a bit, its efforts are far from over. Rather than retreating, the industry has adapted, it has changed course to be able to battle modern regulatory landscapes and public health campaigns. Today, Big Tobacco finds new ways to influence public perceptions and delay action. This could be through lobbying, funding research, or rebranding its product to appear safer. But the strategy remains the same: create doubt, deflect accountability, and protect profits. And in this process, we just need to sacrifice public interests and independent science. Think about it. When we speak of today's rise in anti-science or anti-scientific sentiment, we almost never refer to the role of profit-driven manipulation of scientists and scientific bodies. And then we wonder why people stop trusting scientists. I'm out.